A very good evening to everyone. First of all, thank you very much for having me as a speaker today. Thanks to Dr. Mishra, thanks to Psychoanalysis India, and my good friend Arunabh for that very kind introduction. So, just before we go into the lecture today, to give you a little, I guess, more detail about where I'm coming from. So, as I think Arunabh's introduction suggested, my background is in literary studies, and I work on the interface of psychoanalysis and literature. During my doctoral years, I also took clinical training from Arka Circle, Melbourne, which is now incidentally Arka Circle, Australia, because not everyone is in Melbourne anymore. And I also work in tandem with Australian Centre for Psychoanalysis and the Lacanians there. Now, of course, to cut to chase, we won't really talk a lot about Lacan. I'll begin with him just a little bit, and I'll promise that I'll move over to Freud and Bose, and we'll talk about the two of them primarily. So the reason I wanted to title this Sigmund Freud and Girindrasekhar Bose Reading and Practice of Literature is that, so we'll talk about both Freud and Bose as readers of literature. That's one level of the expression reading. But we'll also talk about psychoanalytic reading and the interfaces between psychoanalytic interpretation and literary interpretation. We try and make this point, in fact, that's one of the underlying claims I'm trying to establish throughout this talk, that the practice of psychoanalysis as a talking cure, the practice of psychoanalysis, let's say, as a practice of speech, has a literary dimension built into it. Okay? So we talk about this literary as a certain linguistic and stylistic inflection which is built into the way speech operates in the clinic. So that's going to be the opening phase of this talk. We'll see what we can do in terms of the length and breadth of it, but we'll begin with this idea of talking cure as a literary practice of speech. Okay, so we'll begin with this rather dense formulation of Lacan's from the 23rd annual seminar, where he's talking about something that he calls symptom or symptom, which is a particular way of inflecting symptom. I'll not go into the really complex first portion of this quote, but I want to have this up there for you to see a particular word play, and we'll keep talking about these things. So let me just read out the quote there. The context, however, is a discussion of the Irish literary writer James Joyce, and he's talking about a certain way in which Joyce, through his literature, works away at his symptom, or symptom, perhaps. Again, we might come back to this if you have questions at some point, but I will not be approaching the differences and the technicalities of that difference between symptom and symptom. But just to read this, it is in so far as the symptom forms a false whole with the symbolic, we can actually disregard that part and concentrate on the rest, that there can be any praxis whatsoever. So he's talking about psychoanalytic praxis. That is to say, something that emanates from the dir. Dir is saying in French. Emanates from the dir, from the fact of saying, from what on this occasion I shall call ardir, to slide towards ardor. I mean, that pun works much better in French. Ardir, the artistic saying, and ardor. Ardor. Okay. Now it's interesting that Lacan first of all calls psychoanalysis an art of speaking, an art. So there's an aesthetic dimension to speech here. And he makes a word play which puns on ardor. Now the point I'm trying to make is, so let's ask a question here. Is this a slip, ardir and ardor? Is it that Lacan wants to say one and ends up saying another? Is it a wit, a witticism? We'll come back to these questions. Or is it like a slippage? So a slippage between the two expressions, ardir and ardeur, which have this, homophone in French especially. So if we begin with that, let's just think of psychoanalytic speech practice as an aesthetic practice, and the aesthetic or literary dimension lies in this wordplay, the homophonic wordplay or the pun that we see here. I thought just to enliven this a little bit, we might have a little video here at this point.
Un jour, dans une séance, je parle à la grande rêve que j'ai.
If you could please pay attention to the subtitle, I'll explain why we have this video here first.
Un jour, dans une séance, je parle à la grande rêve que j'ai fait. Un rêve et je lui dis, je me réveille tous les matins à 5 heures. Et j'ajoute, c'est à 5 heures que la Gestapo est venue chercher les Juifs dans leur maison. À ce moment-là, quand se lève comme une flèche de son fauteuil, vient vers moi et me fait une caresse extrêmement douce sur la joue. J'ai compris Gestapo, le geste.
Vous avez transformé la Gestapo en un geste.
Un geste tendre, il faut le dire. Un geste extrêmement tendre. Et cette surprise-là, ça n'a pas diminué la douleur, mais ça en a fait autre chose. La preuve, maintenant, 40 ans après, je raconte encore ce geste, je l'ai encore sur la joue. C'est un geste aussi qui est un appel à l'humanité, quelque chose comme ça.
So, as we saw in that video, this lady who has had a traumatic experience with the Gestapo cannot help waking up at 5. And what Lacan does there, again, we might come back to the radical nature of this intervention, because he literally performs an act, comes up, touches, and does a gestapo, a skin gesture, does a caress on her cheeks. But the important point is, what is the nature of this analytic intervention? He's trying to change the context, the traumatic context of a particular word. So one of those underlying, I suppose, beliefs that work within psychoanalysis is that there's a certain dimension of suffering that comes from words. And if words can be reorganized, if their chains of association can be changed, perhaps that suffering, if not alleviated, would also change, or at least there would be a transformation in that sense of suffering. So if words make us suffer, and if we can, in a literary way, change the word through homophony, it might also change our sense of attachment with that word. In this case, the attachment concerns a suffering. So what Lacan does is to recontextualize the word Gestapo for her. Whether it works or not is a different discussion. As she herself says, she can feel the caress on her cheek when that word comes back to her years afterwards. So Gestapo turns into Gestapo. So what are we looking at? We are looking at the body of a word. Okay. So, I mean, linguistically we could call this the morphology of the word. So we have 3 syllables in the word Gestapo, Gestapo. And Lacan changes that word through his particular intervention, and it's interesting how it cuts across language from German to French. And he breaks the signifier across the 2 languages, but along morphological lines, in the sense that he turns the 3 syllables or the 3 phonemes in the signifier Gestapo into 3 independent units. And what we have in gesture on the skin is not one word. It's a breakage that turns a word into an expression, a phrase. This is the kind of technique that I'm trying to situate as literary. literary within the practice of psychoanalysis. So, using literary punning to break the morphological body of the word, as I say. Okay. Of course, I'm not the first person to say something like a certain literary dimension is built into psychoanalysis. So let me briefly, at least mention a lot of work that has been done, just to name one or two. So, for example, in the 90s, in the 80s and 90s, a literary critic named Peter Brooks, he did a lot of work which tried to connect narrative with desire. And very simply, in the clinic, what we have is a narration of somebody's life. So there is a storytelling aspect to that, which connects psychoanalysis with literature. And as I said, it's not an absolutely new argument, the argument that I'm presenting to you, but I think I'm going by a different route to establish what has been established from other directions. I'm going by the speech route. So Peter Brooks, for example, talks about narrative and desire, and narrative as desire. So the desire to present your life in the form of a narrative is something that could be considered as the kernel of desire itself. Desire to talk about one's life, let's say. Stephen Vine, in a collection of essays called Literature in Psychoanalysis, again makes the same argument about literature being an endemic dimension to psychoanalysis, but from a different route. Shoshana Feldman talks about the implications, the co-implications of psychoanalysis and literature in a landmark essay going back in time. When Feldman comes back to this particular question of psychoanalysis and literature in a recent work, it's interesting how she uses reading as the connector between psychoanalysis and literature. So let's at least hypothesize this question, whether or not we could argue that the way a psychoanalyst reads in the clinic is at least homologous or similar in certain ways to the way someone reads literature. So whether the acts of interpretation have something to go by on one another. Freud's readings on literature. Let's now concentrate on Freud. Now, there are many directions in which this reading operates, and his multiple texts on literature are testimony to these different directions of reading. There's a certain way in which, in the essay titled The Uncanny, for example, Freud is interested in the very function of the literary as an act of doubling, as an act of uncanny doubling, how a particular self produces a doppelganger, how we are ridden, to speak like that, how we are ridden by the problem of the other, the problem of otherness. Uncanny is an important text also in the sense that it seems to define literature as a movement of this doubling. Literature as workings of the fantastic is something that we will go into, this particular, again, paradigm of literature as a certain kind of a work of fantasy. And we'll try and connect this to psychoanalysis in both Freud and Bose. And again, to quickly go back to uncanny, and one of Freud's insights in that famous essay is that in a certain way it's the familiar that turns unfamiliar. So there is no hard distinction between the familiar and the unfamiliar. The unfamiliar is what in a way turns familiar, and the familiar is what gets defamiliarized or turns unfamiliar through a certain act of uncanny doubling. We'll come back to this idea of the familiar and the unfamiliar in a different context when we talk about Freud's example, the famous example from Heine, another literary writer, the word familionaire. We'll come back to this. So, in Freud, there is sometimes an attempt to see in what way literature can produce at least a parallel work of analysis. Sometimes it's a question of literature as sublimation, how literature can sublimate certain symptoms, but literature is by and large treated as a storehouse of symptoms, as it were. So literature is a place where we get to know about different kinds of symptoms that might be, creating different kinds of disturbance for different people. So again, we could think of the essay on character types and the way Freud talks about different characters, specifically, I mean, one of the famous examples being Macbeth and Lady Macbeth. So character types and that particular essay is an interesting example of this particular dimension. Of course, he's also interested in the author. He's interested in the creative process. He's interested to know in what ways we could consider the creative process as unconscious. And what are the dynamics of that unconscious creative process that leads to a particular text? How do we write, as simple as that? How do authors write? What are the associations that form a text? And Freud sometimes uses literature, and we'll see a similar tendency in Bose sometimes, to illustrate certain psychoanalytic ideas. So there's a certain way in which literature becomes a tool to exemplify ideas. Also, sometimes to make an argument about some evidence, as it were, some indirect evidence of psychoanalytic notions, like the unconscious, for example. Now, I want to focus on one particular way of talking about the literary within psychoanalysis, and that is, and now we are going to the second part of this talk, that is the literary dimensions of the unconscious formations. In Freud, as we know, we have multiple formations of the unconscious. So the question is, how does the unconscious manifest itself? And it manifests itself through certain formations, like the wit, joke, okay? Like a slip of tongue, a slip of pen, something that we want to write and end up writing something else, a word that we want to say but end up saying something else. A dream, of course, is, Freud famously said, dream is the royal road to the unconscious. So dream as a particular formation of the unconscious, wit as a particular formation of the unconscious, slip as another formation of the unconscious, and parapraxis, which could be a multiple things. Let me just explain that. So parapraxis could be a number of bungled actions, failed actions. So let's say if I somehow forget that I have to give this talk today and land up here tomorrow or yesterday, I mean, we'll have to think whether I really want to give this talk or not. Do I not like you guys? Do I not want to speak? Maybe there's something there. So parapraxis, some sort of a bungled action maybe. Now, the point I'm trying to make here is that there is a literary dimension to each of these four unconscious formations that we just mentioned. And we'll go bit by bit to talk about this. Dream as literary. So let's take up dream. I'll come back to dream later on as well through Bose. This is a particular passage from Revision of the Theory of Dreams, a late text in the new introductory lectures on psychoanalysis. Let's just read this. We decide to concern ourselves as little as possible with what we have heard, with the manifest dream. Of course, this manifest dream exhibits all sorts of characteristics which are not entirely a matter of indifference to us. It may be coherent, smoothly constructed like a literary composition. So let's underline that simile that Freud uses, like a literary composition. Or it may be confused to the point of unintelligibility, almost like a delirium. It may contain absurd elements or jokes and apparently witty conclusions. It may seem to the dreamer clear and sharp or obscure and hazy. Its pictures may exhibit the complete sensory strength of perceptions, or may be shadowy like an indistinct mist. Let's also pay attention to the way Freud uses a literary language here. The metaphor of the mist, for example, the indistinct mist. The most diverse characteristics may be present in the same dream, disturbed over various portions of it. The dream finally may show an indifferent emotional tone or be accompanied by feelings of the strongest joy or distress. So the complex question of emotions in a dream. What kind of emotion does a dream evoke? I would like to dwell on this particular point that the dream is constructed like a literary composition. You could think of a painting, you could think of a visual frame, a cinematic scene as it were in the dream. There are, of course, dreams which have an obvious linguistic character, in the sense that we hear sentences in a dream. Sometimes we think someone is saying something in the dream. There could be, apparently non-verbal dreams where no one says anything, but we could still construct the dream in the form of language, in the form of sentences, let's say. But the important point is Freud likens dream and the structure of dream to that of a literary composition. Now, the point that I want to make here, and we'll understand this through the example that I'll give from Girindrasekhar Bose, a particular dream. The point that I'm trying to make is the emergence of the latent content of dreams from the manifest content happens through a literary formation of narrative and in a literary mode of interpretation as well. We'll see this. So, again, let's to talk about the basics here. Of course, for Freud, there are two kinds of content in a dream. One is the manifest content, which can be extremely brief. And then we go into the work in the clinic and we try and unpack that manifest content, and I've specifically chosen a dream from Bose and Bose's practice, which is literally a one-sentence dream. Okay? And we will see how this one-sentence dream can be unpacked into a whole narrative. So again, the point I'm trying to make is that this is literary also because the reading that allows us to come from the manifest content to the latent content is a literary reading. A literary reading, in what way? We'll see we'll see this in the example. So, and again, the idea of interpretation being creative, how the analyst always has to be creative in certain ways. Now, this is a dream that I'm taking from his Bengali book on dreams called Swapna, or Dreams. He discusses a particular dream of his analysand, which is about the collapse of the western wall of the studio. So there's a studio upstairs in his house, and the western wall of that studio collapses. So to translate the sentence from Bangla to English, the dream is just this. So the manifest content is only this. The western side of the second floor studio fell off. That's the only thing he sees in the dream and reports Girindrasekhar Bose, and Bose picks up the thread from there, asks him to free associate on that sentence. What is western? What is second floor? What does studio mean to you? All these words. And free associations mention the cemetery nearby, his father living just below the studio on first floor, and so on. Now, analytic work reveals that the analysand, or patient, had been having quarrels with his father. His father wanted him to rent the house and go to the ancestral property back in the countryside. He did not want to leave. The analysand also said, I quote, "My father lives in the room just below the studio. If the studio breaks down, he will be the first to die." Okay? Immediately after this, he mentioned the cemetery. He also remembered later, this is a very interesting question, he also remembered later that he had once seen his father die in an earlier dream. He never reported this dream before this studio dream. He claimed to have completely forgotten about this dream. Now, my point again is fairly simple, that a certain narrative takes shape. If you think of it, the first sentence, the manifest content of the dream, the western side of the second floor studio fell off, that could be the opening sentence of a story in a creative writing class that you're asked to finish. And you could write that story whichever way you like. I mean, that first sentence has no obvious connection with the death of the father and that being an object of desire. So, of course, that's where the dream interpretation is going, right? That this man wants his father to die, essentially. So that death wish, the death wish directed at the father, is something that perhaps even Holmes will not be able to make out from the sentence, the western side of the second floor studio fell off. So the question is that of a detective reading, shall we say. Okay. So again, the question of reading is what connects the psychoanalytic with the literary, and that's my point. So we'll move on to some more dreams with time, if time permits. Let's go to the second formation of the unconscious. It's Freud's birthday, so I thought I'll give that tribute to him to have the dream first. It's the royal road to the unconscious for Freud. Jokes and their relation to the unconscious, 1905, and this is the first example, perhaps one of the most famous examples from the book. And again, it's interesting that he picks up this example from the travel writings of a famous literary writer, Henry Heine. This particular example, as you have it up there, concerns a character called Hirsch Hyacinth. He's from Hamburg, and he boasts to the poet, poet meaning Heine. So Hirsch Hyacinth of Hamburg boasts to the poet Heine of his relations with the wealthy Baron Rothschild. And finally, he says, it should be says, sorry, and as true as God shall grant me all good things, doctor, I sat beside Solomon Rothschild, and he treated me quite as his equal, quite familiarly. Okay? So this is the word we are going to seize from here, familiar. Okay? And as you can understand, it's a portmanteau of familiar and millionaire. Baron Rothschild is a millionaire, and he didn't expect to be treated as the familiar of the millionaire, but he was treated in a familiar way. Okay? So again, the point of having this example, and of course there are many such examples in Freud's book, is to say or to highlight this particular idea of neologism. So this is an invented word. And we do this all the time, right? I mean, it's not really Heine and Hirsch Hyacinth. I'm sure all of us, if we think back, we'll be able to come up with words that we invent. Like just outside when Dr. Mishra and I were talking about someone who repaired your cycle, and then we called him your psychoanalyst. So something like that. I remember, for example, during my doctoral years when someone was, I guess, trying to terrify me by saying another person from some other part of the world had died because he had continuously been playing a game in front of his computer and not moved an inch for a few days, and he said he died of thrombosis. And the moment he said that, and this friend of mine was talking about the fact that I was just going mad at my own thesis, and I said, yeah, I will die of thrombothesis. So I mean, these are words that we sometimes instantly coin. But the question is the question of witticism. Okay. Now, it's interesting because we try and talk about these two things together, wit and slip. And as I promised, I will not talk too much about Lacan, but there is always a ghost of Lacan somewhere. So let me mention one quick thing that Lacan does talk about at length in one of his earlier seminars, the seminar on the formation of the unconscious. It's interesting that for Lacan, it's the presence of the other and what the other says when you crack a joke that makes the distinction whether it's a joke or a slip. So let's say, for example, I just told you about psychoanalysis and thrombothesis and you laughed. So that's the reaction from the other, an acknowledgement of the fact that this is witticism. If you hadn't laughed, if there was no reaction whatsoever, perhaps you could have seen that as a slip. Not in this kind of speech because I'm analyzing things, but let's say if I use the word thrombothesis in any sentence in a regular conversation, maybe you would think I'm just slipping on that word and making an error. So Lacan's point is, if the other does not acknowledge the witticism, it might as well be considered as a slip. So he goes at length to talk about the validating function of the other, the acknowledging function of the other. And it's an interesting point. I'm not just evoking for the sake of it, because we will see in another formulation later on how otherness and the literary are very much related with one another in a very inextricable way. To come back to familiar. So we are talking about a neologistic invention. It's a neologism. It's a new word that has been coined, familiar. And Freud goes at length to talk about familiar. It's not just this connection of the the familiar and millionaire. It's also a connection that he develops by reading that particular text, the text called The Baths of Lucca, and he goes at length to talk about family. Family as another important word here, another important signifier. So we have family, we have familiar, and we have millionaire. So this word play that we are talking about, in a way, is what I'm trying to define and describe here as the literary. So in other parts of this talk, we will talk about literature as such, literary texts. But here I'm talking about the literary as a particular effect of speech. I mean, the effect of speech could be anything else, but here the effect of speech is of a literary, creative, aesthetic nature. And that's what we are dwelling on. So, for example, just to give a few other examples, they're also pretty entertaining. I'm deliberately choosing the English examples because they're easier to explain here. The German connotations would be complicated to go into. So, Brill, for example, uses this particular word as Freud discusses. Brill uses the word anecdotage. So again, anecdote and doting, dotage. Two words come together in a portmanteau format and they produce this neologism, anecdotage. He also uses the expression that he finds in Brill, alcohol and holidays put together as alcoholidays. Okay, not bad. Now, I want to talk about a very complex example of a slip of tongue. So we are now moving from witticism, joke, to slip of tongue. Again, let's just remember the central thread here. We are talking about these things as formations of the unconscious. So what does the slip tell us about our unconscious? What does the wit tell us about our unconscious? And I'm arguing that these formations have a literary substructure to them, or literary dimension to them. Okay. It's also, let me just also go through that. That's an important gloss on the word familiar. So I think we have already covered that question, but briefly. This composite word, familiar, which is unintelligible in itself, but is immediately understood in its context and recognized as being full of meaning, is the vehicle of the joke's laughter-compelling effect. The mechanism of which, however, is not made in any way clearer by our discovery of the joke technique. In what we can, a linguistic process of what we can call a linguistic process of condensation, accompanied by the formation of a substitute by means of a composite word, give us pleasure and make us laugh. This is a complicated passage. Let me try and unpack this. So, one of the things that I haven't yet mentioned, but I'm interested in developing here, is this idea of, the pair, so to speak, the pair of condensation and displacement. How in dreams, wits, parapraxis and slips, we have the working of these two processes. Condensation, something gets compressed. So in a dream, we might see someone who is not exactly, either my father or my mother or my uncle, or it might be a combination of all these figures. It could be a compression, a condensation. There's also a question of displacement, how things move from one to other, how there's a certain process. And again, as we would see, slip as a function, if you think of it, is something that makes us aware of displacement. Because when we slip on a word, what is the process? We wanted to say a word, ended up saying another. So the word got displaced from familiar to familiar, let's say, or family to familiar, or millionaire to familiar, any of these triads that you might want to talk about. So the important point is, in the dream work, as well as in the joke work, or the work that Freud talks about in Psychopathology of Everyday, there is a question of condensation and displacement. And as I'm sure most of you would know, Lacan famously reads this question linguistically. Condensation for Lacan becomes metaphor, and displacement becomes metonymy. and he aligns symptoms with metaphors, whereas he aligns desire with metonymy. Let's try and understand this. So, when we speak in terms of metaphors, we could think of doing a metaphor analysis in the clinic, where we are trying to unpack what the metaphor of a particular analysand would mean. And let me define symptom here as a metaphorical condensation of tropes, emotions, affects on a particular point of language. So metaphor is a compression. It's a condensation of many things onto a particular linguistic point. Whereas displacement is exactly the opposite process. It's about constant slippage from one thing to another. Okay, I've got an iPhone 3, next thing I need is an iPhone 5, then a 7, then whatever comes next. So it's a whole process of displacing oneself from the relationship with one object to another. So that's Lacan's point, that desire is structured like a metonymy, where we are constantly displacing ourselves in terms of our relationships with multiple objects, and the way we are moving from one object of desire to another. So there is a certain condensation, a movement of condensation in symptoms, and there is a certain movement of displacement, or moving away, as it were, in displacement, which is synonymous in certain ways for Lacan with metonymy. Now, to make the obvious point, but the important point is that these are both rhetorical figures of speech, metaphor and metonymy. So the moment we align something like condensation and symptom with metaphor, and displacement and metonymy with desire, we are not just producing a linguistic frame for psychoanalysis, we are also treating the talking cure, the speech itself, at its rhetorical level, which is a literary level. So the rhetorical level of speech, where metaphors are formed, metonymies are formed, is a literary level of speech. And that's what we are talking about here, not just literature as literature, but the literary effects of the way we speak. Let me quickly discuss this example that Freud himself discusses, a slip of the tongue that occurs in Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice. It's Freud's, one of the most recurrent reference points in literature for Freud is Shakespeare, alongside maybe Heine and Goethe. So this is a section from Portia's speech, Act 3, Scene 2. For the paucity of time, let us just dwell on the last 3 lines and the slip there. So Portia is talking about how much love she has for her lover. And let's just look at the expression. One half of me is yours, the other half yours, mine own, I would say. But if mine, then yours, and so all yours. So if we mark the slip that Freud, of course, is attentive enough to pick up, the slip is this, that, first time it could have been one half of me is yours, the other half is mine. Okay? So she goes yours, and then she corrects, as it were. So in linguistics, sometimes there's a certain way in which we call it repair in linguistics. There's a certain way of repairing speech. I might have blurted out something that I didn't want to. It might have come out the wrong way. I'll correct it. So it looks like a correction there. So one half of me is yours, the other half yours, mine own. That's the correction, I would say. But if mine, then yours, and so all yours. So this is the important point. Portia not just makes a slip, she interprets the slip. And she produces a certain logic for her own slip. So Portia's point is, I did not say mine, I said yours, because what is mine is also yours. So that becomes a superlative proclamation of love. So it's interesting how she corrects the slip and makes it work, interprets it. So it's an interpretation of a slip, and that's the important point to keep in mind here. It's not just a slip, it's a very interesting psychoanalytically aware interpretation of the slip. So she's taking the slip on board taking it into her stride, as it were. Now, I want to briefly talk about a parapraxis as well to make this structure complete. We've briefly touched upon dream, slip, wit, and now a parapraxis, which is also connected with a slip. So it's a slip as well as a parapraxis, I would say. I don't have a slide for this. This is a narrative. Let's just try and pay attention to this. So we are talking about a mother who mentions 12 fingers to the daughter. And this leads to a certain logic of a repressed number, how a number is repressed. Let's just look at the narrative here. So what happens is, there's a dialogue between the mother and daughter that the mother, who's the analysand, reports in clinic. And the mother says, so it's a dialogue where in a very casual conversation, the mother says, yeah, but I have to work on my 12 fingers in an obvious way. And the daughter balks at that. She's like, 12 fingers, really? So it's interesting how the analysand approaches this number 12 in the clinic. It comes up with a very strong sense of, denial, distancing. So she says the 12th of no month means anything very special to me. When the analyst asks, does this have to do with the 12th of a month? But it's interesting again, as we go on into the process of analysis, as Freud describes it, the birthday of her husband's old uncle, her husband is dead, the birthday of her husband's old uncle is the 12th. And interestingly, after making that slip about 12 fingers, she forgets this birthday. So there's a certain expectation of inheritance from this old uncle. And because of this expectation, she keeps sending very diligently a birthday card to the uncle on the 11th, so that it reaches him on the 12th. It's this year, after making the slip, that she somehow forgets. So forgetting is the parapraxis we are talking about. Forgetting as bungled action. So she forgets the birthday of the uncle, and it comes out, again, through a lot of analysis, of course, that there's a certain wish for the uncle's death, which would, of course, materialize the inheritance. Unless he dies, she will not inherit. And she's having a lot of financial difficulties at this point, bringing up multiple kids. Her husband is no more. So all these things add up in a way. I'm just trying to give you a gist of the entire case. So it's also interesting that later on she says, people in my husband's family tend to be born with 6 fingers on their feet. That's another connection with the 12. So we have a slip around a number. Instead of saying 10 fingers, she says 12. But that again opens up this huge array of things, including, the dead husband's old uncle, the expectation of inheritance, and the death wish. So all these are, if you think of it, literary narratives that come out of psychoanalytic clinic. And again, they come through this particular process of reading that we call free association. Okay, so let's just try and understand that point. So the forgetting, as I say, is the bungled action, and it's important that it happens after she makes the slip, not before. She forgets December 12 and all that. And again, Freud also discusses at the latter stages of this particular case how there's a certain death wish against her abnormal children. I mean, abnormal in the sense that, so both her daughters had very serious mental health problems. One of them was catatonic, she had catatonic attacks, and the other was someone with severe neurosis, to use Freud's expression. So there's a certain death wish operating against these children as well, the 2 daughters. So it's a very complex wish as well. Death wishes operating towards and against multiple people at the same time. So again, to draw the line, the way the entire story emerges from the slip and the bungled action is a function of literary reading. That's what I'm claiming here. And again, it goes back to that particular point that Feldman and others have developed when they talk about the literature psychoanalysis interface, that the unconscious is that which demands a reading. The unconscious demands to be read. This demand is important. Now let me again make a quick formulation here before moving on to the next half of this talk, which is, again, we won't really get the time to develop this. I'm happy to talk about this in the questions and answers. Literature is a discourse of the other. That's the formulation and formation perhaps that I'm trying to create here. So it is a locus. Literature is a place where others speak in a very simple fundamental sense. When we take up a book to read, it's an other. Someone else has written that book, or maybe others collaboratively have written a book, and now I'm reading voices. If it's a fictional text or poetry, I'm reading voices that are not necessarily the authors. I'm reading voices that are produced by the author. So literature has a fundamental relation with otherness. Literature is one of the ways in which we listen to the other, through the act of reading. So I'm making this connection because in certain ways, the point that we are driving home in all these formations. Okay, so I will skip a particular section here. Yeah, let me just, we can come back to some of these things later. Let me just go to Girindrasekhar Bose now, whom we have already mentioned, the founder of the Indian Psychoanalytical Society in 1921. Now, just to take a quick departure from, of course, a wealth of literature that exists on Bose, Ashish Nandi, Christian Hartnack, and others, they've talked about the knowledge system debate and the position of Girindrasekhar Bose in relation to Western psychoanalysis. Again, in a slightly different context, though there is no mention of Bose, this is a question that works through a particular talk that became a text later on by Jacques Derrida on geopsychoanalysis. Geographic specificities of psychoanalysis is something that he talks about, and uses this expression aboriginal psychoanalysis, which is again picked up in an interesting way by Anup Dhar, who has discussed at length the Bose-Freud correspondence, and he has also contextualized this in terms of the history of science in India, for example. So that's a very different kind of reading, which I'm simply departing from without any opposition, of course, that I'm not really going to go into those aspects, and especially the intercultural aspects of Freud-Bose dialogue. I mean, there's a lot of great work on that. And to add to it, again, in more recent times, Alf Hittelbetter has written a book called Freud's India, which is a detailed history, so to speak, of this correspondence, and a very meticulous working through with not just Bose's texts, but also texts of some of the students. And it's a very interesting book. In case you haven't read it, I will definitely recommend that. Came out last year. My interest lies in Bose's referential and practical use of literature in his psychoanalytic thought. So we will see how he uses literature, how literature emerges, as we've been discussing, as an intrinsic part of psychoanalytic thinking, his psychoanalytic thinking, and finally we will see how he practices literature as a children's writer in the novella Lal Kalo, or Red and Black, and in what ways is his practice as a literary writer informed by his psychoanalytic ideas. So I'm going to briefly touch upon a few things here. So in Bose's work, we find a customary reference to literature as we do in Freud. So there's a reference to Coleridge's dream poem, Kubla Khan, and how dream is part of a certain creative process for the writer. He mentions Tagore's novel, Rabindranath Tagore's novel, Rajoshi, half of which was supposedly seen in a dream. So again, there's an illustrative function in the way in which he uses literature. For example, he talks about time in dreams and how even a moment can be a lifetime in a dream. And he uses a very interesting example there, a very less discussed story, let's say, Troilokonath's short story called Birbala, where a character falls asleep for a second and literally has a very, very long dream in that second. He almost wakes up as he falls asleep. So the head lowers, and there's a certain pain he feels in his shoulder, and that makes him wake up. So it's in the same movement that he dozes off and comes back to wakefulness. but in that same second, he has dreamt a lifetime. And that's his point, that in the unconscious, the dream, the time has a different order. There's also a whole lot of references to Veda and Purana, and it seems that he uses, especially the ancient Indian texts, be it Kama Sutra or Purana or Veda, as a textual support for some of the evidences, the indirect evidences for psychoanalytic ideas that he's looking for. So just to give one example, this is again from the Book of Dreams. In the Sri Krishna Janma Khanda of the Purana, Krishna tells Nananda, uncle, whatever man consigned to the sickness of thinking ponders during the day, they see all of that in their nocturnal dreams. So again, he uses this particular passage just to situate the question that the idea that dream is the fulfillment of an unconscious wish was there from ancient times, as it were. It's not absolutely new or something like that. So he writes, in fact, a critical response. Again, we don't have the time to go into the nitty-gritties of that. He responds to a particular a dialogue that happened between Shorshilal Sarkar and Rabindranath Tagore, and it was published in Probashi in 1928. And he responds to that letter in a critical way by saying that there's a misunderstanding of psychoanalysis in that text, for example, because they're not concerning themselves with the unconscious. And Bose's point is, it's not psychoanalysis what they're talking about there. They're talking about psychology, because they're talking about the conscious mind. Again, we might come back to this if you have questions, but I would like to go into the heart of the question that I want to approach in Bose. So I want to emphasize the theory of opposite wishes. Again, most of you might be familiar with this. So Bose has a particular theory of opposite wishes, which is not just about positive and negative wish. It's also about active and passive wish. And I'm going to dwell on this active and passive aspect of the opposite wishes. There's a certain, again, critical dialogue with Freud here. Freud doesn't quite like this theory of opposite wishes. Freud says it's more formal than dynamic in the letters. We'll just change the chronology a little bit and come back to some of those earlier passages of Bose later on. So again, this is from Chopno. Bose writes, just give me a second. Bose writes, I have the wish to give money. What kind of wish can oppose this wish? Let us consider this. If I say the wish not to give money is the opposite wish of the wish to give, it won't be correct. There's no such thing as a negative wish. Okay? A wish is always positive. We have to understand that it is due to some positive wish that I do not want to give money. Underneath the apparently negative wish not to give money is the positive wish to preserve money. Now he wavers on this, to be honest. So it's not that here in this passage, which is why I wanted to introduce this passage from his Bengali works, it's interesting because he seems to make this observation that there is no such thing as a negative wish. Every wish is positive, so the opposite wish is never really an opposition of the positive and the negative, it's an opposition of the active and the passive. So the active wish is to love someone, the passive wish is to be loved by someone, by the same person hopefully. So the active wish is to, these are all examples he himself gives. The active wish is to, kiss someone, and the passive wish is to be kissed by the same person again, hopefully. The third one, I'm not sure whether the same logic will work, and he calls it retaliation. To hit and to be hit. It's a counterintuitive idea. So if we say, when I'm hitting someone, I want to be hit back by that person, it's not something that we intuitively think of. And again, let's suspend this point here, but he does talk about the active and the passive wishes, and one of them will become unconscious due to the mechanism of repression. That's his point. So just to go into the second passage here, what is the opposite wish of pouring water into the tumbler? It is the wish to become a tumbler, full to the brim with water. In each action, that subjects and objects are opposites to one another, you might ask who but a madman would want to be a tumbler? Fair enough, but it is owing to such a passive wish in the unconscious that we can understand the meaning of the desire to pour water into the tumbler. Now, this is the point I want to focus on and talk about this idea of fantasy, literature as fantasy, and the literary as a certain incarnation of the fantastic. And there are many examples of this in Bose's work. He also talks about paraphrenics, who might have a particular case that he mentions is someone who wants to be a tree, and each time he is standing anywhere near a tree, he feels as if he has become a tree. Now, the important point is, if we translate this question into language, it comes down to active voice and passive voice in a grammatical sense. And as we know, we cannot have passive voice for certain sentences. I'm going to school, my grammar would have to be extremely shoddy, I suppose, to produce a passive sentence there. There is no passive sentence, right? So the question that I can only pose here, because of paucity of time, is whether or not we can read Bose's theory of opposite wishes in a linguistic way. So that's the question I have in mind. And again, I raise that question for certain textual traces. So he himself, in some of these references to the opposite wishes, talks about intransitive verbs, transitive verbs and intransitive verbs. So verbs that have an object is transitive, verbs that do not have an object is intransitive. And he says, does intransitive verb actually not have an object? So again, we could think of this question through the prism of language, through the prism of grammar, not to incarcerate the unconscious in language, but I would say exactly to do the opposite thing, to show how sometimes linguistic grammar fails to point us towards an object, and there could still be an object there. So again, it comes back to the question, what is an object? And what is this wish to embody the inanimate object? Let me come back to where I started. So the wish to become a tumbler. Why? Because I want to understand my desire, what it means to fill up a tumbler, fill in a tumbler. Similarly, let's say, the wish to become tree. These are wishes, let's say, to become the non-human, the inanimate as well as the non-human. Now, I would say that this desire to embody the object, the inanimate object or the non-human object, the tumbler or the tree, is the phantasm that I am designating as literary here. So a literary phantasm, the wish to embody this object. And we've already briefly mentioned the correlate with the grammatical voice. Now, I don't think so how much time do I have? 15 minutes? Okay, thank you. So I'll try and wrap it up in 15 minutes, which might mean we'll be a little dense, so we might come back to these things during the questioning. So there's another point that I at least briefly wanted to mention from Bose. So some of this might be repetitive, so let me just go to the long conclusion of this particular text called the Ambivalence. So in this text, Bose is talking about the ambivalence of mental life, the opposite wish theory and repression. All of it is an intrinsic part of this ambivalence. And again, I want to see whether or not there's a certain literary idea of ambivalence at work here. Because if you think of it at one level, literature is what generates ambivalence. We cannot be sure about the one and only meaning of a literary text, and hence people like me go on and on interpreting literary texts. To sum up, this is from the text Ambivalence. To sum up, this is Bose. My contention is that pairs of opposite wishes are to be found not only in love and social intercourse, but also in our dealings with inanimate objects. There's no wish without its opposite counterpart. Where the object is inanimate and the wish act is not reversible, the opposite counter-wish seldom goes beyond the stage of latency. The latent counterpart helps us to appreciate the characteristics of the object. In paraphrenics, in whom words or verbal images take the place of things, reversal of a wish situation even with an inanimate object, may occur. My patient said he became a tree when he looked at one. In reversible acts where reciprocity is possible, both the opposite wishes can dawn upon consciousness. If the opportunities for satisfaction for one are greater than those of the other, a conflict is set up within the psyche, and repression results. One of the elements of the pair then tends to become unconscious. It is the opposite wish that provides the prime motive force for repression. All other factors are secondary. So let me just quickly come to the end there. So he's talking about certain ego identification here. Identification, projection, interjection, turning round and reversal of an instinct, ambivalence, conscience, moral values, sense of social propriety, etc. are best explained by the assumption of opposite wishes producing conflict at different points of the wish circuit. So what is ambivalence for Bose in this context? Ambivalence happens when we cannot decide, as it were, and when the opposite wishes are not very neatly distributed between the conscious and unconscious. And there's a certain complication or a certain conflict that results from that ambivalence, let's say. So let's just keep this point about ambivalence in mind as we go into the last part of this talk. So here I want to, again, at least briefly think through this question with all of you, and I'm very happy to receive any kind of feedback on this part especially, and other parts. So I'm trying to map certain psychoanalytic ideas onto Shada Kalo, Red and Black, which is a 1929 novelette that Girindrasekhar Bose wrote. As some of you might know, he's also the brother of a famous Bengali writer, Boroshuram. Now, this is Girindrasekhar's only foray into literature. And it's interesting, the genre that he chooses. It's children's literature. And it's an apparently innocuous text, but not quite, as we will see. So it deals with this battle of red and black ants. And again, I'll just make a few observations and close at this stage. So we have right away the use of animal fable, animals, and again the association with, the older questions in Freud, perhaps instinctualism, the animal sexuality and its animal motivations, as it were. It's interesting, and again we might come back to this at the end, but there seems to be perhaps an obvious lack of the sexual trope in this text, and we'll come back to this question. Now we have this battle of two ants, the red and the black, and it is essentially informed by a sexual taunt. So the red male ant, as described by the text, taunts black female ant, and that's where it all starts. So there is an implicit marking of sexuality, at least, and the question that I would raise here is whether or not there's a certain literary mechanism of repression here. So very simply, is Bose not repressing sexuality because it's a children's literary text? So that could be a literary act of repression that falls inside the genres of literature and the expectations and somewhat moral expectations from the different genres of literature. Again, we might come back to this question, but that's one of the ideas I wanted to float out. It's interesting how he uses the nonsense verse tradition. Clearly, I will not be able to do justice to this nonsense verse end rhyme. This is an attempt. But it's interesting how he's using the nonsense verse form in this novella to clearly, as you can see here, air a psychoanalytic idea. Eyes don't see him, ears don't hear, mind says in some nook, here, it's here. Knees totter, sweat pours, opening its giant mouth, the one without a name roars. This is how a particular ant talks about this dream of being eaten up by a huge red ant. So this is a black ant talking about the dream, his dream, the dream that he had of being eaten up by a gigantic red ant. And the nonsense verse is a linguistic modulation on this dream. So again, what I want to briefly talk about, two things, and we finish there. One is this fear of being eaten up. And it connects back to this very interesting dialogue, again a critical dialogue between Bose and Freud, at round about the same time in 1929. So if we read the letters in 1929, one of the major points of difference between Freud and Bose seems to be that for Freud, Bose is not emphasizing castration anxiety as much as he should, according to Freud, and the desire to be a woman in a man. So that's the context, very briefly laid out to you. So for Freud, castration anxiety is absolutely the key, for Bose not quite. Now, it's interesting how, if we map this question onto this, as I said, apparently naive children's literary text, there are some interesting questions here, because in Freud, and again I'm condensing things here, we could open it up a little later in the discussion, but in Freud there is this consistent association of eating up with castration. Eating up, more specifically, let me just briefly mention one. Let's look at the first passage up there. Hitherto, it is only in men that I have found the fear of being eaten up. This is Freud. This fear is referred to the father, but it is probably the product of a transformation of oral aggressivity directed to the mother. The child wants to eat up its mother, from whom it has had its nourishment. In the case of the father, there is no such obvious determinant for the wish. So again, we might come back to this question, but what I'm trying to wonder, in a sense, is whether or not the eating up references which abound in this novella have something to do with castration. And honestly, I have to think through this question much more. I think I've just begun with this particular question. The other question is, in what way death drive finds a certain function in this text. So what happens is that there's this mega battle which is going to happen, and it's very interesting how Bose creates a social Darwinism in the animal world. So we have a food chain, and we have an evocation of all these bigger and smaller animals, and how they eat each other, as it were. And so, for example, when the mouse is invoked, he doesn't want to come in because there's a snake around. He doesn't want to be eaten up by the snake. So there is a certain food cycle here at work. Now, what is interesting is sometimes, and again we come back to the question of ambivalence there, the sexuality of these animals remains unmarked. And as a result, it's very difficult to do this simplistic mapping of the dreams which are about eating up with castration. So what I'm also trying to do here is to use this literary text as a negative example for applied readings of psychoanalysis onto literature. There are certain ways in which that kind of an applied reading generates more ambivalence than anything else. And maybe that's one of the takeaway points. But to finish with Death Drive, which is where I am here, so what happens is we have one of the ants who is an engineer ant and who comes up with this particular technique of making them fly. So this engineer ant is going to make them grow wings so that they can fly and attack the other gang of ants. And it's very interesting here. So we have this discussion between pundits who say that in the ancient texts of Ant Shastra, as it were, it is said that ants should not grow wings. They'll grow wings only to die. They don't listen, at least the engineer ant doesn't listen, and we have a certain mobilization of that desire, and they grow wings and attack only to die. So again, what I'm trying to situate here is the question of death drive, whether there's a certain wish to die at work here. And let me end with that, just one very quick maybe summation of the different threads we opened up. So we talked about how literary is intrinsic to the speech practice of psychoanalysis and tried establishing that through the four formations of the unconscious. And I tried showing how Freud uses literature to talk about those formations, but also how a certain operation of the literary is intrinsic to those formations. We went ahead and talked about opposite wish and the active-passive connection, and whether or not it can be translated linguistically into the question of the voice. And again, the question there is whether or not this linguistic coding is total or complete is there a certain part of the unconscious that does not reduce itself, shall we say, or render itself in and through grammatical language, grammar being the rule of language, as it were. And we ended up with Lal Kalo as a certain literary text where we possibly could map psychoanalytic ideas. There are traces in the text which almost obviously make this association, but then there are traces in the text which also complicate this question. So why is, for example, Girindrasekhar using these psychoanalytic myths of castration through the fear of being eaten up, when at the same time he's disagreeing strongly with Freud about the fear of castration being a central fear in the unconscious? So again, we could come back to these questions, but my point was also to show how a certain simplistic mapping of psychoanalytic ideas on a literary text may or may not work. But what it produces in this case, when we know that the writer is also a practicing psychoanalyst, is a very complicated sense of ambivalence where we do not know how to interpret. And in not knowing how to interpret lies, in a way, one of those ambivalences of the literary and the psychoanalytic that, as both interpreters of literature and as interpreters of, let's say, symptoms in the clinic, we all have to grapple with. Thank you very much for your listening.
Okay, so thank you so much. It was quite a dense paper. A lot of thoughts have been evoked on Freud's point. What I'll do is I'll open it up to questions. I think it is very interesting how you've allowed us to think of the relationship in the psyche and the unconscious. Let's open it up to questions and we'll try to link things together.
So thank you for that. It should get a lot of complex and very sensitively rendered presentation. I wish to focus on one aspect that relates to, of course, what might describe as a kind of conservative side to Freud's thinking, particularly with respect to jokes and its relation to the unconscious, and how that might be perhaps even contrasted with his kind of more radical, perhaps, side as manifested in the essay on the uncanny. So the idea of a homeostatic mechanism being at work, and finally the necessity of equilibrium being restored, seems to be a key to so many of these formulations with respect to the workings of language in comedic or humorous form, even with respect to wit per se. And it seems to me that he's sort of drawing on perhaps the earlier theories of comedy preceding the advent of more, say, complex theories of comedy and humor that came to the fore post-Meredith, say, in the case of, say, a thinker like Bergson, or the contemporary of Freud, or later Umberto Eco's essay on wit and humor, and a way in which humor might even work in the interstices of the tragic. So the question would be then, is our Indian psychoanalyst sort of bringing in a more dialectical version, as it were? Is he sort of breaking this kind of conservative framework through this emphasis on the dialectic, as it were, at work in this interplay between opposites, in your view? So that's the real thought which came to mind. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So, shall we take questions and then I'll respond together, maybe? So I'm just noting down the questions. Shall we just take quite a few questions and then?
Hello. May I speak in Hindi?
Sure.
Okay. फ्रायड के मनोविश्लेषणवाद के सिद्धांत के आधार पर हिंदी साहित्य में, मैं हिंदी लिटरेचर का स्टूडेंट हूँ, तो वहाँ पर उस सिद्धांत के आधार पर जो वास्तविक लेखन की शुरुआत होती है वो उपन्यास के माध्यम से होती है, जो कि 1930 ईस्वी के आसपास जैनेन्द्र के उपन्यास के माध्यम से होती है। तो मैं जानकारी के लिए ये पूछना चाह रहा हूँ कि क्या बंगाल में मनोविश्लेषणवाद सिद्धांत के आधार पर साहित्य लेखन की शुरुआत उससे पहले होती है, और वो कब से होती है?
आपने कौन से साल का मेंशन?
1930.
1930. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, you have made an exhaustive analysis, of psychoanalytics. But my question is, Sigmund Freud expired in 1939. Today it is nearly 2019, 20. 90 years have elapsed. And in between is a period where we had different things for different men. For example, we have witnessed a world where there is deadening speculation, where there is tentative experimentation, where there is artificial intelligence, emotional intelligence, and what not. We can go on adding. So, what different do you find the world one exposed or explained by Sigmund Freud and the modern world of today? Any difference between the two viewpoint, thoughts, idioms and ideologies in the world of psychoanalytics? And otherwise, if you would like to comment on the same thing, the quintessence of Lady Chatterley's lover, what Sigmund Freud wants to convey in the final analysis in that historic novel.
Maybe I could try and address them.
Pride on being eaten up. The opposite and birth also born.
Freud's references to birth, you know?
This would also mean Freud, what Freud said after he was eaten up.
So let me maybe try and approach some of these questions, and we can take more if time permits. Okay, so let me try and answer in the same order, the order of the questions. Is Bose bringing in a dialectical formation? A very interesting set of remarks that you made and the question at the end. I would be inclined to say yes. I think the notion of opposition and the way, because this is a very complicated, I had a huge lot of notes and not really a paper. What I presented was what I presented and how I spoke, but I wanted to do that also in this crowd because that's one of the ways in which we practice as well. There's a certain free association, but we know it's not really free. There is always a logic of association. So if one pits Bose's idea of opposite wishes against the scattered formulations on contradiction in Freud, contradiction and the notion of contradiction in Freud, and how he wavers, how he begins by saying there is no contradiction in the unconscious, and then he says how the contradiction, he comes to this other part within the interpretation of dreams itself, when he talks about how contradiction can be represented in the unconscious. It opens up something really interesting. Also in the Little Hands case study, Freud talks about opposition being quite central to mental life. So it's again a very complicated opposition between Freud and Bose as well, which is not, I think dialectic is the right way of thinking about that, because it's not a hard-boiled opposition. It's a shift of emphasis. It's also perhaps a little polemical and speculative in nature between the two of them. But I think it would be interesting to consider this question in its largest possible framing, whether or not psychoanalysis and the way the practice happens is something that can be called dialectical or not. That's a very interesting question. How psychoanalytic interpretation might involve a certain kind of dialectic. We see at least some of that in, for example, the Dora case and the way the dialectic operates. But how psychoanalysis addresses this dialectic, does it dissolve it, does it resolve it? This is perhaps the most difficult question to answer. And I don't think I'll be able to answer this question here. But I think off the top of my head, that's the response I have, I'm afraid. The second question, again, a very important question. I'm not a historian, but Hindi literature, and 1930 is when you say, perhaps, so correct me if I'm wrong, I think your point was 1930 is when we have a psychoanalytically influenced Hindi literature for the first time. Was that your point? So I'll have to go back to my dates, and I'm not very good at them. But there is, of course, a certain influence of psychoanalysis on Bengali literature that has been traced and can be traced within Tagore as well. So it's interesting. So in one of the, I can't exactly remember where, in one of the paintings, when he talks about how he came to paint the face that he did, he has a 3 or 4 line poem which mocks psychoanalysis to a certain extent and says, oh, maybe the psychoanalysts know how I came to paint this face. But then he drops that word, psychoanalysis, from the published version. And the text that I was talking about also, is 1929, before 1930, right? But the writers were often quite traditionally considered, in certain ways, Freudian in Bengali literature would be Manik Bandyopadhyay and some of the later writers, not in the 30s, but maybe in the 50s and 60s. So it's a difficult question to answer. But if we consider Lal Kalo as a psychoanalytically inflected literary text, that is 1929. I mean, that much I can say. What difference does one find between Freud's world and the modern world? I really don't think I can answer that question, because it's a huge question. This is not to say it's not important, but it's a huge question. Of course, there are so many differences, but in certain ways there are also similarities. The point is not to see Freud as a prophet, I suppose, or not to see Freud as an all-knowing and all-correct person, because Freud himself didn't have that notion about himself. I mean, there's an incredible flexibility in Freud's work and a constant speculative, conjectural movement. For example, just to give one of many examples, the way he wavers on whether emotions are repressed or not is quite incredible across his work. So it's really complicated, and Freud, I think, speaks from his practice, doesn't speak like a philosopher, speaks from the very strong anchor points of his practice. To give one example, I think if we think of the culture of hate in today's world, perhaps there's some Freudian angle which I think is still quite relevant to understand something like the troll culture, let's say, in digital media, social media. The way we want to hurt the other. Why do we want to hurt the other? Sometimes unnecessarily, sometimes even another we do not know. It's a random hurt, as it were. So these complex questions, I think, are questions where Freud may not have the only answer, but Freud has something to speak to our times, I think. I mean, that's the only thing that I can say. I'm not very sure whether I understood this last question. So, are you talking about references to birth in Freud's work?
You're comparing opposites.
Mm-hmm. So, being eaten up is the opposite of giving birth. Is that what you're saying? That's a very interesting point, yes. So, now I understand it, I think. This is not a research that I've done, honestly, but I'll have to think of the way Freud talks about birth. Of course, he does at many points in his work, and the biological question is there in his work in a certain, in a very complicated way again. But we could, of course, consider being given birth to as the opposite of being eaten up, and whether there's a certain connection there with, again, off the top of my head, I'm thinking of trauma of birth and that particular association, birth itself as trauma, an idea that, of course, Freud had from the name just dropped out. I'm sure you know the writer of the trauma of birth. For whatever reasons, I can't remember the name at this point. Something might explain this forgetting, but shall we move on to the next question, if there is any?
I really don't have a question as per se, but what I was actually observing throughout your presentation, definitely the emphasis was more on the literary and literature, and especially the way you were looking the psychoanalytic literature, especially the Freudian literature, and looking at it from the various dimensions. What actually I'm keen. I'm not a student of literature. I've never been, frankly. But what is intriguing me, how you understand clinical as a word, quote unquote. How you understand clinic, or how you understand clinical processes, because the way you were defining it was also, I was looking at from various ends how a clinician actually works in its clinic, because you were talking about the speech and how the talk work primarily, and how talk has been understood. So I am keen on first how you understand clinical work. Not to offend you, frankly, I'm not offending you anyway. Second thing is the psychoanalytic interpretation, the clinical interpretation, because what you are actually somehow emphasizing more on is literary interpretations, and definitely there is always an edge-to-edge conflict in our clinical work every time, and how to define and how to see other and how to see ourselves and how to make such kind of distinction. That's very interesting what you presented here. So I just thought, let me share my thought.
I think there's another question.
See, this is not a question per se, but a kind of hypothetical assumption from me. Since you have briefly touched upon Thor's idea of aboriginality, can we think in that way that Girindrasekhar Bose's revision of a kind of a certain Eurocentric model of Freud's psychoanalysis, can it be thought in the kind of a national context that is a probably developing kind of national idiom of psychoanalysis during the situation and the time? Can we think in that way?
Okay, thank you for these two questions. Okay, yeah, there's no doubt about the fact that I was talking more about literature, partly because of my own background, I suppose, and the way I position myself between literature and psychoanalysis. But I think I was not just talking about interpretation of literary texts, but I was also saying how a certain way of speaking in a literary way, and for that one doesn't need to be the student of literature. That would be an incredibly elitist stance to take, and I would stay away from that. So I think I would like to believe all of us speak in different ways, and one of those ways of speaking is the literary. Now, I was wondering whether in clinic we can sometimes make literature work in that sense by being creative, not always to make word plays, that's just one dimension, right? But also to understand the connection between associations. So again, from a practical point of view, sometimes what we trace when we listen to an analysand in the clinic is how one shifts from one topic, let's say, to another. And how these two topics are apparently completely unconnected. And it takes a certain kind of imaginative leap sometimes to try and connect those two topics and open up a question there, not really suggest that, oh, you're connecting A with B, so the two of them are causally linked. Of course, a good practitioner wouldn't necessarily do that. But maybe to open up a question, whether there is some connection. So I noticed that you drifted from this topic to that topic. Do you see a connection there? Something like that could be a clinical way of opening up a question on the basis of the drift, on the drift of the free association. So again, what I'm wondering is whether the way we talk about how literature works can be built into this. So again, the question of imagination. And again, I'm thinking of this particular essay in Freud, Constructions in Analysis, where he makes a distinction between interpretation and construction. And he's humble enough to say that constructions might be wrong, but at certain stages in the clinic, sometimes we have to perhaps make a slightly bold construction, which is a hypothesis. It might be completely rubbished by the analysand, but something might come out of that, again, to come back to that idea of dialectic, the dialectical process in which I'm rubbished by my analysands. Analysands are sometimes there to rubbish, right? And that process of dialectic is also something that needs to be brought in here. So that's the only observation I'll make here, but I do take your point, the point that you're making. Aboriginality and national idiom. This is again a very difficult question. In fact, I have a follow-up question, if I may, if you don't mind. What do you think could be a national idiom of psychoanalysis in an Indian context? Because I don't think I understand that point very clearly. Maybe you have a particular thought on that. So I'm just trying to understand your question in a better way, if you may.
The fact is that both those psychoanalysts, both Girindrasekhar Bose and Freud, had certain one point of difference, and that being the castration complex. So in that sense, don't you think this is a kind of a revisionist strategy, politically strategized by Girindrasekhar Bose to kind of construct a kind of national forum for psychoanalysis? Can it be historically situated? Because the time also permits to think in that way, because the time Girindrasekhar writes, so it's the correspondence that both of them had. So can we think politically in that way, that the historical situation of Girindrasekhar Bose revision and the observation of Sigmund Freud is
So very quickly of moving away from castration complex in your way of thinking?
That being that he is a kind of a psychoanalyst who is taking points from Sigmund Freud, and then he is trying to build anew something which is more suitable to Indian experiences, Indian cultures, and that being the kind of a political statement in that sense.
Okay, I get it now. So, I mean, yes, for sure. I mean, because it's interesting, and again, of course, Anupta has written a lot on this, how there's a certain cultural relativism in the correspondence itself. So Freud becomes a little more guarded the moment Bose says, I don't see this often enough in Indian patients. And Freud doesn't know, and again, to give it to Freud, he doesn't want to be this master of all, right? So he says, well, I don't know, maybe you're correct there. So, I suppose there is, my answer would be yes, but this is not a question I've thought through. So, and again, it would be interesting to think how in a more specific way. So I understand how you're talking about politics here. So political assertion would be again coming around that question of colonial knowledge and how we appropriate colonial knowledge, but also differentiate and create a practice of our own. Yeah, but I'll have to think through this.
Anurag, you have two questions. You have two questions.
Aruna.
Yeah, I think one of the ways in which our national idiom is to speak in fables, and one of the fables in India is "Ye cheete ke par nikal aaye to," bad things are going to happen. In my understanding, the black ant could be seen to be he himself, Indian psychoanalysis, as opposed to the red. And often at that time, Britishers were supposed to be red in the face when they got angry. Huge people, and that we should approach them with caution, and we may survive. So says the Ant Shastra. And we have indeed survived, and maybe it is time now that we can, engineer our wings and talk about things like that in psychoanalysis, India, and so on and so forth.
That's a very, very interesting observation. Thank you.
National relegated.
We'll take two more questions from there.
It's not as much of a question as it is also a comment. And this is what the talk made me think of. So, bringing in a literary understanding of psychoanalysis in a time, let's say in Delhi, where liberal arts universities have psychoanalytically oriented clinics. So I was thinking of these two things together. and how there is actually a university student kind of subjectivity that is being created, where an engagement through psychoanalytic work becomes a possibility. And then I was thinking about how the nature of literature has also changed from, let's say, 19th century to now, where initially literature could engage with human suffering and existentialism in a certain kind of manner, but the millennial will not have access to that kind of literature at the current time. So in that moment, in the current context, I think the turn towards that you're making of literary understanding of psychoanalysis is particularly pertinent for the university context. The other thing I was thinking about is, you ended with the death drive, but I don't think you got a chance to go into it as much. Given the current scenario, specifically in universities and in general, where the turn towards the inanimate is coming through technology, and the turn towards destruction is coming in interpersonal relationships. I think the death drive as a concept would become an important one, but what could its manifestations be is something I was curious about.
Maybe I'll take the second question as well.
Yeah. Again, this is less of a question and more of a thought that occurred to me since we watched that video where Lacan changes Gestapo to Gestapo. I was thinking of Wolfman and how Wolfman said that Freud misinterpreted his dream, that he was not talking about a bag of six, but instead his sister, and Torok and Abraham go into great detail to talk about cryptonomy and So I was wondering that in offering interpretations or creating these moments in the clinic where we connect with what the patient is saying, and perhaps in a dream or through free association, there is a large threat of being reductivist, and instead of then breaking the body of the word, we could just end up breaking the body as is. Yeah, thank you.
All these three, including these are comments. Thank you very much for the first set of comments. I mean, I don't really have an answer to this or a response, but one of the things I was thinking in a certain way was how the colonial encounter could be written into Shada Kalo, but I hadn't thought of this in this fashion. And also the point about fable being a national idiom. Fantastic. Thank you so much. Second comment, again, very pertinent, your comment, and thank you so much. You could find a certain echo or resonance, a contemporary resonance here. What could be the manifestation of death drive through technology, through the inanimate? Again, it's a difficult question, but I think we can already see in certain ways. I mean, this obsession with the smartphone, for example, and how it creates a kind of, let's say, an autistic subjective reality. We could think of this. And again, because of my obsession, to use the same word, with Beckett, I keep thinking of these recurrent images in Beckett of two people walking together, hand in hand, but hands that are forgotten in one another. And this idea of, there being a union, but they don't really know whether they're united. So through smartphones, we like to think that we're always connected, but are we? And how does technology feed on questions of aggressivity, questions of death? Again, something to think of. Perhaps, again, we could think of the death drive that might animate technologization of terrorism, for example. It's also, this is again a big question, and I don't think I can respond off the top of my head, but thank you so much. And definitely, in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, if we look at that particular passage where Freud famously defines the death drive, the definition works its way through inanimate objects. And the point is, he begins with saying something like, oh, there were stones in the world before there were humans. And the way it finds resonances with what is, now within the university discourse, may I say, a certain emphasis on the non-human, also an attempt to think through technology as a critical question. For example, in the works of Stiegler and others. Again, we could go far off into this, but let me not. Interpretation as reductive. So perhaps I did not understand one particular nuance of this question. Thank you for it again. So do you think the kind of interpretation we are talking about here, the creationist interpretation, if I may say, the creative interpretation, is that something that you think could be reductive? Is that what you're saying, or maybe I heard you the other way?
I was just suggesting that in the desire to offer an interpretation, that parapraxis that you mentioned could be something that creates an alternate timeline, so to speak.
And you gave a particular example which I forgot to note down. Sorry.
So in Turok and Abraham.
Yeah. Kryptonim.
The Kryptonim, yeah.
Okay, so that's interesting. Wolfman, right? Yeah, again, that's a whole can of worms, perhaps, very quickly. Again, the question of name and cryptonymy and this idea of encryption, burial is the metaphor that Abraham and Turok continuously use. Again, one could, so as I'm saying, I'm not just using psychoanalytic interpretations of literature. In another argument, we could say that the burial trope, the metaphor of burial, the way that works in Nicholas Abraham and Maria Turok, is in itself a certain inflection of the literary. And the way the burial metaphor covers the notion of cryptonymy. And again, in literature, sometimes we are trying to unpack what is encrypted, and we are trying to unpack what is sealed up, as it were, within the text in certain ways. I somehow think, this is just an observation, I somehow think to import something like a literary model of interpretation in psychoanalysis, if we think of the efficacies of that, I would actually argue on the opposite side of things and say that perhaps the whole point is to try and uncouple interpretation from reductionism, or uncouple interpretation from reductivism, because in a certain way, I mean, I'm being very pragmatic here, of course, an effective interpretation in certain cases within the clinic might be more important than a correct interpretation. An interpretation that has an effect, that dissolves something for the analysand, is, I think, automatically a correct interpretation, even though it may not have the positivist truth value, so to speak. So again, I think the whole, if you ask me the polemical aspect of this connection that I'm trying to make between literary and clinical interpretation is to try and take it away from reductivism. And I think that is there in psychoanalysis in an independent way as well.
Could I say something? I'm sorry, the gentleman has left. Who asked about how it has changed. You see that earlier the idea was that this man wishes to become a tree, and that is a strange thing. But in the things which have changed in the last 80 rather than 90 years is that we see the human being as part of the inorganic structure which speaks. That we are made of the same material as the wood and this and that. In fact, we are burning the bodies of our ancestors when we burn oil. And that constitutes us, that we are part of the inorganic world which has developed the capacity to speak. So when you say that this is the interpretation, is the decoding, yes, what he was talking about. And I'm sorry, I'm going to be a bit abstruse, but artificial intelligence, essentially all that is encoded in our DNA and the molecular structure. And this encoding is now you and me speaking to each other. Earlier, it was the other way around, that the human was at the central trying to explain this. Now we see ourselves as part of a longer time, and as the encoding which is beginning to speak into literature, into this and that. And at another level in artificial intelligence, etc., we are encoding into DNA information, right, which is already encoded in us. So we are moving from yet another, like Freud, Copernicus, they displaced the subject. Now we are going again to even bigger displacement into the post-human world, where we see the commonality between everything, and that the human is the coding which has started to speak. I'm sorry for the... So when you say the interpretation makes it explicit, it is actually explicit rather than reductionist.
Thank you. If I may, just take forward the discussion. On two lines which occurred to me during the exchange of ideas. So one was, I wondered if you had looked at the kind of theorization by someone like Cathy Carroll, who, as you know, kind of brings in the psychoanalytic paradigm, while looking especially at the literature of the Holocaust and evolving a whole theory of how the wound continues to speak in the context of trauma theory, which is, of course, an area she has extensively developed and theorized. Now, can one simply map those ideas which stem from engagement with the Holocaust context onto other, say, traumatic events or historically sort of distressing, say, collective experiences like, say, partition, for example? Or does one again need to develop a kind of culturally specific idiom, more sensitive perhaps to the absence, say, of individualism in our context, as one, say, theorist has sort of argued? The second point that I wanted to make was in relation to what has just been said, but we also need to be, I think, a little cautious while thinking about conceptions of the post-human in this light. We mustn't succumb to the temptation of romanticizing that drift. As Harari reminds us, there's a considerable degree of corporate investment involved in this kind of, as it were, drive towards technologization and the creation of what he calls beings who will be ultimately immortal. So technology, including biotech, is actually going to enable the emergence of what he calls homo deus. And only a few people are going to make it in that direction, because there's a huge amount of capital investment required for some people to be able to elect for that choice. The rest of humanity, well, you'll continue to live out your limited lifespan. So let's be a little cautious while thinking towards this kind of technologized world, which is not certainly a brave new world in any stretch of the imagination. Thank you.
Okay, so very quickly, just brief responses maybe. Again, very interesting the way you're talking about human being as part of the inorganic and the way it starts to speak. The question of coding there. It's interesting to think in what ways the unconscious itself plays out to this human, or shall we say transhuman or post-human dynamic. So a larger question, of course I don't have an answer for this, is to think whether this post-human, transhuman ethos has changed the character of the unconscious in certain ways. That would be an interesting question for me to at least get into this discussion. To speak to this last comment, partition, Holocaust, again, as a literary scholar at least, I would say it's a good idea to try and make the literature, let's say Manto for example, in the partition context, to let the literature speak for itself, whether we can apply things like Cathy Carruth there. And if there is a certain justification that comes from the text, why not? But if there isn't, perhaps we have to think of, as we're saying, a more culture-specific paradigm of trauma on its own. The question about post-human, again, let me just make one very brief observation here to connect both these threads. It's also, again, a big question, but it's a question to think about, I suppose. What political function, it might echo some of the questions from the other audience members, whether or not, and in what ways can we think of the political function of the practice of psychoanalysis? What is its relation to something like biopolitics? Is psychoanalysis a management at all? Is it a management of life and death, which is what biopolitics is? What is psychoanalysis's connection with state? And again, there's a lot of literature on this as well. I was not really getting into those political dimensions, but from this dialectical exchange, shall we say, it's interesting, that we could open up that question as well.
So we'll close the talk for this year. Thank you very much, Dr. Chattopadhyay, and we'll see you all next year. Aruna.
Thank you both. Very for cheering. More memento for you every year.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for being such a patient, kind, and engaging audience.
Rushi.